Welcome to the Sustainable Dish Podcast. I'm Diana Rogers, a real food registered dietitian, author, and sustainability advocate. I co-host this podcast with James Connolly, who was a producer on my film, Sacred Cow. I also founded the Global Food Justice Alliance, an initiative advocating for the inclusion of animal-sourced foods like meat, dairy, and eggs for a more nutritious, sustainable, and equitable worldwide food system. You can check it out and join me at globalfoodjustice.org. Thanks again for listening, and now on to our show.
Good morning. So this is James Connolly with a Sustainable Dishes podcast. I have this sort of very special life. It's been really kind of. I have to tell you, Robert. One of the strangest things about this is I've recorded 3 podcasts within the last maybe a month and a half or so. One was a German veterinarian who works with camel herders in Rajasthan in India. And she works with pastoralist societies all across the planet. And then another person was a person who had written a book about Davos, about these sort of 200 or 150 private jets that all sort of meet up every year in Switzerland and kind of talk about the future of humanity, the super rich, the ultra wealthy, and everything like that. And I had sort of reached out to my, I really had this like, running list of like 10 people on the planet I really, really wanted to talk to. So I sent it to my intern, and it just a hope and a prayer. And Robert Whitaker was able to find some time and get back to me. And I have to say, I've listened to probably 70% of your podcast. I've read your book. I find all of this stuff absolutely fascinating and interesting. So let me introduce you. Robert Whitaker is an American journalist and author who has won numerous awards as a journalist covering medicine and science, including the George Polk Award for Medical Writing and the National Association for Science Writers Award for Best Magazine Article. In 1998, he co-wrote a series of psychiatric research for the Boston Globe. There was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service. His first book, Mad in America, was named by Discover Magazine as one of the best science books of 2002, which is when it came out. Anatomy of an Epidemic won the 2010 Investigative Reporters and Editors Book Award for Best Investigative Journalism. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Well, thanks for having me. That was quite the introduction, by the way. That may have been the most flattering thing I've ever heard. I have to say I'm a little jealous of you, though, when I hear the range of people you're getting to speak to. What a life to be able to speak to, this wide range of people doing different things. So I think from being a reporter, that's the best thing in life, when you get to meet other people, be curious about other subjects. So anyway, you're a blessed person.
It's really about stories, right? I mean, it's the only way my memory works is I try to sort of fill a life with stories. And your story is really interesting. I tried to conceptualize some aspect of the way, because if you look at the history of psychology, you get a sense that it was always moving in this general direction, and that there was a sort of coordinated movement with very few outliers and critics sort of working against this. And the more you learn about it, there had always been a pushback against the way that psychology had been moving in its myriad different forms over the course of, say, the last 140 years or so. And there had always been critics, there'd be people who'd sort of push back on that. But I do feel like in some ways your book kind of like created a wave that allowed for a number of different psychiatrists and psychologists to then sort of feed off of that information to start to correlate this stuff in a way that the general public could actually start to read into it, because everybody is within their own circle, and if you're reading, say, Irving Kirsch's work on serotonin and the depression and a lot of the studies that were done, you're reading that, you may take that as kind of maybe a one-off. You may take that as something that maybe is sort of blip within that structure, but you start to correlate all of these different stories, the history of it, and you start to really come up with a pattern that you call sort of cognitive dissonance. Like these groups do not want to look at the mirror of themselves and say, hey, maybe we got this wrong. So I kind of want to start out a little bit with the sort of 19th century sort of the birth of the history of psychology. Maybe they were called alienists at the time, and the sort of understanding of the way that we started to quantify and utilize the idea of different structures like schizophrenia or depression, and stuff like that. I wonder if you can kind of start out with that.
Well, yeah, there is sort of a long-running narrative or story within this history of psychiatry and psychology. And this is a narrative that really goes to this question. You know, what is normal and where are we going to decide when there's sort of craziness? And of course, you know, and I like to make the reference to Shakespeare. If you watch a Shakespeare play or read your Shakespeare, you know, he presents human beings in this very emotional way that we can be normal people can have these incredibly fierce emotions of jealousy, rage, and that sort of thing. So right away in this field, you start asking is, well, when do people become crazy? When do we assert control over the crazy people? Because does society do that? And also, then once you have those questions in present with you, you're going to have all sorts of questions of power. Who gets to say that the other people are crazy? Is it men? Is it people who, like in the United States, is it basically Caucasian people who get to make this definition? And then you have to look at the interests of who are making these definitions. So, for example, if it's medical people, and sort of madness really gets medicalized. Well, there's a certain strain of it a long time ago, but really in English speaking, it goes back to when you had mad doctors in, I think it's the 17th century, starting to write texts. But it's the medical people who are going to have the authority over this domain. If that's the case, they're going to try to put it into a medical context. These people have illnesses, okay? And then these other people don't have illnesses, okay? And you're going to try to draw some line. If you come from it at the psychological question, it's a little bit different. You're starting to look at how environment also and how families shape our response to the world and how these experiences shape the way to the world. And in general, I think if you take that psychological approach, in general, it leads to a more expanded sort of sense of what is okay and normal and to be expected in human beings. But then the third perspective you have as you try to sort through these histories is the perspective of those who get identified as the other. Because so much of this is identifying people as the other. They're not like us. And therefore, they're sort of a threat to our social stability or whatever. And what you find is another narrative there that is so powerful. And this is what I try to weave into Mad in America, this book, is what is it like to be a person who's identified as the other and therefore treated as the other? And so often that involves taking away sort of the agency of that person over themselves, including the right to be out in society. Mm-hmm. And what you find is those are three different narratives that clash so often, especially the narrative of those who have been identified as crazy and as treated. Because so often what they see, and their voice, by the way, is discounted in the medical narrative. They're unreliable witnesses to themselves.
Right.
But when you actually look at their writings and all, so often they're very insightful about their own lives. And what they see themselves as is being defined as the other, because they're just not going along with sort of whatever the mainstream currents are. Or, for example, if you're in the 19th century, if you're a Black man after 1865, well, now all of a sudden you're identified, as someone less than human. So, and then you'll also see a difference, and if we talk about the mad patients, where they see treatments as not as helpful medical things, but as things meant to quiet them, make them afraid, restrain them, that sort of thing. And then, of course, within this history, we have the, women being identified as too emotional, hysterical, and all. So I think the point is, this is such a rich subject to understand how narratives get formed, how we think about ourselves, how we think about, quote, the other. And so this is what I think, what you see is these narratives changing over time too, in terms of the medical, psychological narrative. But that's what makes it such a rich and important subject, because it really goes to, how do we think about human beings? How do you think what as we move through life that affects us as human beings? What drives some people to sort of have these crazy thoughts and all? So it's a really rich subject for seeing different histories or different narratives within history, and those narratives changing over time as the larger cultural narratives change as well. So it's such a rich subject.
Yeah, as I was reading your book, one of the sort of funny things that kept on coming up, because I think you and I searched in different ways, sort of parallel structures that I found there were so many sort of overlaps. And I kept on recalling reading your book. I kept on thinking about phrenology. And then lo and behold, I'm looking at the cover and it's actually a phrenological head. And so having studied the history of sort of phrenology, so much of it is really based upon this idea of sort of characteristics of what is a civilizational structure of what is mainly primarily Caucasian people. And so when you would look at the bumps on people's head, you would look at very specific characteristics. Intelligence wasn't really part of a 19th century construct of, the way the mind worked. Character seemed to have been sort of a part of that structure. And so there were specific bumps that were like the love of the sea and adventure. There was a bump for,
Right.
Any number of different things, but most of it was set up around the idea that white people were civilization builders. And so conformity actually mattered a lot to the structure of that head. And so when you looked at the other, which was the other races, any deviation to that performed perfection of that structure was considered to be, an other, right? And so, we tend to think of it as a pseudoscience now. At the end of the 19th century, phrenology textbooks had sold 5 times more than On the Origin of Species, which had been out for close to 40 years at that point.
Wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, it really informed a lot of the way that we moved into the 20th century, the origins of anthropology, which was, again, a civilizational structure. So you saw this pyramidal form of history that kind of moved up this ladder to the civilization builders. And you can sort of see a sort of schizophrenic history in that, right? Like you can see the way that they were building this, but then also, building a structure by which they then talked about heredity, they talked about germplasm, they talked about all of these different things. And so one of the stories you told, which I found really interesting, was this sort of look into encephalitis lethargica. And some of the symptomatic responses of when Kraepelin was studying patients who were actually suffering from diseases, say even syphilis, right? You would look at a number of different symptoms, and then you would associate that with a disease that has then been transferred into the 20th century. So I wonder if you can tell a little bit of that story.
Yeah, sure. So the encephalitis lethargica study, so before the last part of the 19th century, you had basically people classified as insane. And there wasn't these sort of, schizophrenia hadn't been born yet as its own term, diagnostic term. So towards the last part of this 19th century, there was a researcher named, a psychiatrist named Emil Kraepelin, who just followed people. This is starting in the late 1890s, of patients in the hospital who came into the hospital with psychosis. And what was their long-term course? And he noticed that basically there was 2 different courses for those who presented with psychosis. One, if they presented with affect, with emotional engagement, they had manic depressive illness, and they generally had an episodic course. In other words, it wasn't a chronic disorder. They would have a time of mania, they might have a time of depression, but then it would remit. And this is the course in nature, okay, not even treated. That was one group of psychotic patients. Now, there was a different group of psychotic patients that presented with a lack of affect, okay? And he said that group of patients tended to, over the long term, end up demented, dementia praecox, early dementia. Okay? So that was the two different courses they identified in the late 1890s. Then, but there was also a viral infection that began circulating at this time that wasn't initially identified. And once it gets identified as encephalitis lethargica, okay? And I think it was around 1918 or something that gets identified. And what is the course of encephalitis lethargica? Well, you sort of retreat, you become comatose, you don't engage with the world, and they all of a sudden had a hard time distinguishing dementia praecox patients from encephalitis lethargica patients. And what becomes clear in retrospective is many of the people, or maybe basically all of those people that were dementia praecox, had a viral infection. However, by 1920, the sort of American Psychiatric Association didn't want to give up the schizophrenia diagnosis. And now it shifts. And what happens in 1920, they start putting all these people with new onset psychosis into the schizophrenia category. And at the same time, they start saying these people have a genetic defect. Okay. So because we now have eugenics in full blown. So now because of that, they say we need to keep these people locked up in asylums to prevent them from breeding. Now, once you lock people up in asylums for long term, they tend to have deteriorating courses. So what you see here is a new understanding of schizophrenia emerge in the 1920s of people even with new onset psychosis, who in the past, since they present with that fact, would have been seen as having just an episodic problem. They get recategorized as having a chronic disorder. Okay. And that's and they need to be, it's not gonna get better with time, and they need to be kept up because they have these bad genes. So that's a moment where a lot of things come together. 1890s is part of the ability to start identifying viral infections, okay? And what is interesting here is that by 1920, when it gets identified, it becomes evident that a lot of people with viral infections are getting diagnosed with dementia praecox or schizophrenia, but they don't want to give up that term. So now they sort of redefine who has schizophrenia, and that has, even today, that has implications, because schizophrenia, quote, is still a term for saying chronically ill people. They're going to be ill forever. And actually, if you go back to first episode psychosis, it's just not true. I hope I answered your question, or at least
encephalitis lethargica is a really interesting disease. There's a book called Awakenings, where they'd given him Oliver Sacks, and they had given a medication to people who had been asleep for, I don't know, at this point maybe 20 years. And they came back awake, and they had very specific, like very strange, they almost had a time distortion, any number of different things. But it was sort of scary. Like, you could wake these people up. You'd ask them who the president was, you'd ask them their name, they could remember. But if they were left alone even for a second, they would just fall back asleep. A really scary disease, I think, for a lot of people. And so when you have something like that, people want an answer. And so I think psychology ended up sort of filling in the gaps of that. One of the things you say over and over again is, in the book, which will sort of lead us into the 1980s, is episodic versus chronic. And those are two terms that I think are really important to sort of highlight at this time, because I do think it's really important, because we live in a world now where episodic is now just automatically defined as chronic, right?
Yeah, this is the big tragedy in society as a whole. And the reason is because if you look in nature, psychiatric distress disorders symptoms are so often, actually, if they're not tied to an actual illness like Parkinson's disorder or encephalitis lethargica, or say a vitamin deficiency or something like that, they're really so often episodic. Particularly, okay, obviously anxiety comes and goes. Depression was always seen as mostly episodic. There was a small group of people they identified with melancholy that were the symptoms of depression were seen as out of proportion to whatever setback had happened in life, whatever the environment was. But that was a tiny, tiny people. And when we think about episodic, one of the beautiful things is that of people's resilience to setbacks in life. And also it's a philosophy that shows we're not steady state creatures. We have times when we have difficulties, times when we're better. And that it's also a recognition that human beings are very emotional, and things like mania, they may be just within the scope of normalcy, so to speak, to have sometimes of mania. Depression, certainly within the scope of normalcy, that sort of thing. And with that thought in mind, and you see it in nature, by the way, and you see it even in what you were talking when we first spoke about the quantification of symptoms, okay, in the 1950s, they're going to try to like set up, frameworks for testing new drugs and all, and diminishment of symptoms. But if you go back in the 1950s, you see that like with new onset psychosis, for example, first episode admissions to psychiatric hospitals for psychosis, and get diagnosed with schizophrenia at this time. 2/3 would be well enough, 2/3 to 80% would be well enough to leave within a year. Now, some people are leaving after 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. And if you look at stay well rates and able to function in society, it was about 2/3 of those patients 5 years later, they're not on disability and they're just sort of returned to life. But what happened was, and depression was the same thing. If you look at what people said about depression in the 1970s, at the very heights of the NIMH, they said, depression almost always remits on its own. The best thing we can do with antidepressants is maybe speed up that natural healing process, okay? So prior to 1980, we had this sense that so often disorders were episodic. If you had a timeout, and by the way, the nervous breakdown word sort of speaks about that. It doesn't mean that you're chronically ill, but they had a time that you had a breakdown, you need some rest or whatever, you can get back together. But then we reconceptualized things as chronic in 1980. When I say we, I mean the American Psychiatric Association. So now what's going to say is, oh, depression is a brain disease. Now think about what that does. It's no longer your reaction to environment, setbacks in life, divorce, losing, grief, or whatever. It's something wrong inside your head. And if that's so, and if it's a chemical imbalance, you're going to need treatment forever. So it's reconceptualized as a chronic disorder. Our society, and there was all sorts of, quote, educational programs to convince people of that, and we can talk about that. But think about the loss philosophically. One, we move from a vision of human beings as resilient, as so often having a difficult time and then getting their lives back, to now, post-1980, we say, this is a defect within you that is always there. And we even have things saying, oh, you can diagnose ADHD in a 2-year-old, as if that's a permanent part of that individual's being, so to speak. This is where, and what has happened since we've reconception, when I say we, again, this came from the American Psychiatric Association.
Yeah.
What has been the public health effect of that? Well, the burden of mental disorders is soared in every country that has adopted this conceptualization. Outcomes have worsened because think about this. You're now predicting it's chronic. That's now the standard. So we completely lost sight in this thing of the capacity for people to recover. And that's where we're at today. And this is the great, you began, James, about talking about these cultural changes and these societal changes. Since 1980, we have been living in a culture that psychiatrizes us, the psychiatrization of us. And now, since it's 40 years later, we've seen the impact of that, the results of that. And by the way, in the entire human history, I don't think there's ever been a time where they psychiatrized people this way. They narrowed the what is normal so greatly. I mean, what do we say to what percentage of kids today, when they go to college, have a diagnosis? Take a guess.
Yeah.
25 to 30%. What percent of kids access mental health services at colleges? More than 50%. So that tells you how we've expanded this sense of something being wrong with people to where now it's almost the majority. And it just shows that how that is an artificial construct. It's not a construct found in nature. It doesn't make sense. where you have 25% of your people said to be mentally ill. Now, I will say one thing, it may mean that you have to look at society and the structure of society. Why are so many people anxious, unhappy, depressed? That it may be a signal like that, like the canary in the coal mine. Like, why is it in our society we have this unbelievable degree of supposed almost dysfunction related to psychiatric problems?
Yeah, I have a quote that I picked up years and years ago that I want to get your reaction on, and it's from what is the NIH, the British equivalent of the NIH. They're
National Health Service, yeah, or NICE.
Yeah,
NICE.
and yeah, NHS. So my patients' presentations frequently bear out the reality that life in the UK is getting harder. The fortunes of the haves and have-nots are diverging. The fabric of the welfare state thins. Employment entitlements grow precarious. The Archbishop of Canterbury calls our economic model broken. Many people receiving a diagnosis of depression might be more authentically seen as carrying generic social suffering. The doctor can do little about the patient's social predicament, but feels he must do something, and so he prescribes an antidepressant by reflex.
Yeah, I mean, that's a brilliant quote, because, like there's all sorts of studies that shows the more unequal societies you get, the more unhappiness you get.
Yeah.
And what this is leading to is, and thank God it's finally emerging, is something called the social determinants of health. And this even extends, it doesn't just extend to, emotional well-being or mental well-being, it extends to physical health too. And if you see rising levels of emotional distress, rising levels of, there are certain diseases, of course, that are very much socially bound in terms of what food you can afford, that sort of thing. Where do you get your calories? Are you in meaningful work? That sort of thing. And I think we've had this time that became so mechanistic where, diseases are within the individual. Diabetes is just within the individual. Depression is within the individual. Bipolar is within the individual. ADHD. And now, thank God, and that is a failed philosophy of being. That's what we know from a public health level. That's a failed philosophy of being. Now, can you shift to where you look at these larger, how do we organize our society? Because that's what you're talking about. What quote is about? How do you organize your society? And all the evidence shows that, first of all, huge disparities in wealth are a problem. There's a group that's really had done a survey on this, and it really just lines up. The more inequality you get, the more sort of unhappiness. But also, how does society raise its children? That's a big thing. How does it encourage curiosity, self-responsibility, so a sense of self-confidence, all those things? Then you also have to look at the meaning of work in society. How much does society offer people a chance to do meaningful work, things where they go home from work and said, oh, I did something that makes me feel good? And I'll give you a simple thing. If I'm a plumber and I go out and fix a plumbing job, I actually feel pretty good about that because I have used, I have solved a problem. Okay. Right. And I'm having a solving. But you have so many jobs. There's a guy named Peter Sterling who writes about this from an anthropological point of view. If you have jobs that are unrewarded, that what you're doing, you're not solving anything, that you just sort of wrote, that leads to sort of unhappiness because you just don't feel like you're being engaged, your problem solving, your capacity to do things is really being engaged. So what I think is so important is, and obviously access to food, access to exercise, access to sort of social engagement. They're also important, but they're important in physical health, and physical and mental health are intertwined, no question about it. But what that quote is saying is we need to look at the social determinants of health. And 40 years ago, we've been doing all these health things inside the individual. We'll fix the individual. It hasn't worked. So what we need to do is create different social, societal responses to nurture our children better, our physical health better, our mental health better.
Yeah, I remember listening to a TED Talk that was talking about our administrative state. And he was telling a story about uh, somebody who he works in a hospital and he's supposed to clean rooms. He's supposed to move from room to room. He has to quantify the time spent in the room. He has to, any number of different factors that kind of go into his day. And he gets pulled in by his supervisor. And he's like, he said, you didn't clean room 215 or you didn't clean room 306 within this time frame. And he said, listen, I could have done that, but this was a child who had just gotten into a car accident, an 18-year-old. His family had just visited. You think I was going to go into that room and just clean around these people at the worst moment of their lives? And so he just wasn't given the independence of thought to be treated like a human being so that he can make an executive decision at the time, because he has to live by these these standard rules that are kind of put in place to control people. And I think it's in many ways, it's like David Graeber wrote a book called Bullshit Jobs, and he kind of talks about that. He said there were certain jobs that, like, you may not know it's bullshit, right? But there are ones that people know. And a lot of them are administrative ones. They're there to kind of placeholders to hold somebody in place. And it's so demeaning to the human spirit that you kind of live within this framework where, like, you're just going in every single day and sort of punching numbers and just looking at the clock. And it's like, how mind numbing is that? And then at the end result of that, you feel like we have an organizational system, a cultural system that says that there must be something wrong with you, because you're feeling this way. And it is difficult. I want to push back a little bit. So I want to, I think the 80s is so important to the way that we understand today. But the 70s is the lead up to that. And the crisis of the 70s had many different elements to it. And I wonder if you can kind of talk to that, because I think the answer to that solution was, the seeding of that was in the 70s.
Yeah, absolutely. So you have to ask, why did we get this new conception? Can I just say one thing about this story you just told? Think about how it's not just mind numbing, it's soul numbing. Yeah. So that individual, as he went about cleaning rooms, was actually being attentive to the social engagement of other people. Okay, so and you can see he's responding to those people socially in that room. But now he's being, just be a robot, just do efficiency study. You have this in the post office, you have it in so many jobs where you're just treated like an automaton. So that's obviously part of the problem right there in terms of a lot of work. Going back to the 70s, it is really important. So why did American psychiatry adopt this disease model? Now, it's sometimes pitched to us that it was sort of a scientific advance. That's just not true. You have to look at what was going on in society in the 60s and 70s that led to this. The first was an anti-psychiatry movement that really came out of academia and then was sort of joined by sort of people who had been put in mental hospitals. And this was the idea that psychiatrists are not real doctors, and that psychiatry functions as an agency of social control. And it serves the powers that be by saying these people can be put in an asylum and kept there. Okay, and that the asylums were really more like, they were agencies of social control like prisons. Okay, so that was the first threat. The second threat came because in the 60s, we get an explosion of people doing therapy, counselors, psychologists. So psychiatry in the 60s sort of had two domains of authority in the United States. And I think this is somewhat true abroad, but really in the United States was one authority over the mental hospitals. And then in the psychoanalytic sense, it was the shrink who's talking to people on the couch. So psychiatrists were seen as having the best talk therapy, okay? The problem was all of a sudden, research didn't show that their talk therapy was any better than any other talk therapy. So why did you need to go for a psychiatrist for that? Because it's more expensive. So that was sort of the second sort of a threat to their place in society, their image in society. A third thing came from movies. Think of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which presented the psychiatrists as the crazy people and the people in the hospital really as the more sane people. So films are so that's also a threat. They also have a problem that benzodiazepines, which were the first Valium and all, were the first real popular drugs were addictive. So now their drugs that they prescribe are also seen as a problem in the 70s. And then finally, their diagnoses are come to be revealed sort of as ineffective. There's a famous study by a psychologist where he has ordinary people go into mental hospitals. They say they're hearing voices.
Yeah.
And as it was reported was that the staff never, they get diagnosed with schizophrenia. These people stop behaving as if they have anything wrong with them, and they're never noticed to be normal by the staff. And I forget exactly the name, but the point is,
it's called the Thud experiment.
What's that?
The Thud experiment. I think.
Well, no, this is called the
popular.
Rosenhan is the guy who did it.
Okay.
But there was this famous thing is we can't identify, we can't distinguish insanity from sanity. So a week after that gets published, basically the APA says, we got to redo our image. We have all these threats against us. Our future is in doubt. The New York Times writes a thing about the age of anxiety for psychiatry. There were so few people medical residents wanting to go into psychiatry. So they said to themselves is, what is the image in society that has such prestige among physicians? It's the white coat physician who treats, in essence, infectious disease or these other known diseases. And remember, we get antibiotics in the late 1940s and they revolutionized medicine. So, and we get better living through chemistry in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
So now they want to identify with physicians who treat known medical illnesses. So what they do is now, with that in mind, that there's a guild interest in mind, they're going to say, we're going to reconceptualize things as brain diseases. So now the interesting thing is in 1980, they published the 3rd edition of their Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And it's presented as this great scientific advance, even among themselves. Oh, now we're really thinking, medically, scientifically. But there were no discoveries behind that reconceptualization. What you have is guild impulses behind it. And now then what happens is, once they do that, they set out basically a PR plan to convince the American public that these are real illnesses. And we get a book called The Broken Brain by Nancy Andreasen. That's a big a bestseller in 1984, and it's about this switch from these are psychological problems so often into these are brain disease problems. Now, what's interesting about that book, if you actually read it, she says these are hypotheses, and we hope to prove it in the next few years that we'll find the genes, we'll find the molecular problems. But she says, oh, but the hint is maybe these are due to chemical imbalances. The point is, oh, now, by the way, who loves this story? Because DSM-3 has even though they say these are distinct disorders, I think there's 290 diagnoses. And the reason there's so many, they said, we have to have a diagnosis for everybody who comes in to us, just complaining, etc. Who loves this? The drug industry loves this. Because the pharmaceutical industry can get approval for drugs for illnesses. They can't get a drug approved for unhappiness. They can't get a drug for a kid who doesn't like school. But they can get a drug for the illness of depression. They can get a drug for the illness of ADHD. They realize right away this is going to expand the market because it's going to take what previously was seen as normal behaviors within the range of normalcy and feedback and put them into the illness category. And they can see this is going to stir this greatly expanded market. So they begin paying money to the American Psychiatric Association and to doctors, psychiatrists at academic medical centers to be their advisors, consultants, etc., to sell this story to the American public. So the important part of this is, and by the way, Jeffrey Lieberman, who's the past president of the American Psychiatric Association, said, I think, he's speaking now, I think DSM-3 is the most important book written in the last 50 years. And he didn't mean just within psychiatry, he meant within society. And I agree. That book has had the most impact on society, our society, developed countries, and really around the world than any other book, because it gave us a new philosophy of being, a new way to see ourselves, a new way to see our children within this disease framework. And then we were presented with the chemical imbalance story that told us they had found the molecules that cause all this. They had found the abnormalities. So this changed our sense of self. And the reason it was so profound is it was never true. They never actually found that these distinct chemical imbalances were characteristic of all these things. They never found that there were specific genes. They never validated their diagnostic manual. They never validated that disease model, and that's as widely recognized today. It's all collapsed. But that's the new world that was born in 1980, and it was born of guild influences, a guild that wanted to present itself in a white coat, and they, as part of that, they wanted to present themselves as making these great scientific discoveries. But unfortunately, they were dealing with the human brain and the human body, which is the most complex thing ever, and it just doesn't lend itself to these reductionist ways of looking at it.
Mhm. And you have a lot of quotes on your website, specifically people head of Psychological Association, their reaction to, I think, a lot of the work that's been done, even just within the last couple of years. But actually, I want to kind of start it. You were giving a lecture a while back, and you said that when your book first came out, it really did sort of, it was considered so radical at the time, could almost not be, in a way, sort of engaged within the community. There had to have been a number of different studies and subsequent studies and other books that came out to now a decade or so even later, people are starting to really sort of pull back on these threads. So you have a number of different quotes that are kind of used in one of your articles where you said, well, we always kind of knew that, right?
Yeah.
we always knew it was part of a larger form of understanding of depression, but none of that ever trickled down through say pharmaceutical advertisements, through the general public. By coincidence, last night I was just watching a Netflix special as a comedian who had gotten up there. A third of her show is about her diagnosis. And she gets treated for bipolar disease. The psychiatrist recommends a benzo. Sorry, I always forget the name of it. Benzodiazepine. That she's on. She has to stay on that. And part of her reasoning behind it is, well, now because of her psychiatric illness, she is now, on a Netflix special, right? And she's dealing with childhood trauma. She's dealing with the loss of her mother at a very early age. She's dealing with any number of different factors that are she's quite literally, on a psychiatric's couch on stage. But the sort of one of the interesting parts about because pharmaceutical companies can advertise to the American public, which is only allowed in two countries, the United States and New Zealand, they have gotten us to the point where we actually do the self-diagnosis, right? We go to the doctor. We say we may have this thing, this DSM sort of quality, and then we medicalize ourselves and then ask for those pills.
Yeah, that's the brilliant part of the marketing of this whole story is they have built a way for us, and it became so much part of the sort of discourse in our society today, increasingly, where it wasn't 50 years ago. This just wasn't this quite, we had the discourse around the Freudian stories, but that was a different discourse.
Yeah. Correct.
So now we have this new discourse, and people are invited to, through the marketing of this, to see themselves within these structures, right? So you're not happy, or your kid's not doing quite as well as school, or so instead of talking about, oh, listen, I lost my mother when I was 13, or whatever it might be, and saying how I dealt with that, it's like, if I'm feeling these uncomfortable feelings, there must be something wrong with me, and there's a pill out there that will fix it. That's that's what the message is. Or fix your kid, that sort of thing. And so, yes, people now self-identify within this construct that was sold to us. The problem is, of course, and you alluded to this in what we were just speaking about, is the chemical imbalance theory fell apart very early. So the theory arose in the 1960s based on what drugs did. So you have an antipsychotic blocks dopamine receptors. They say, well, maybe schizophrenia is due to too much dopamine. The antidepressant raises monoamine levels, and serotonin is a monoamine. So maybe people with depression have too little serotonin. But if you actually follow the scientific research, when they actually tried to see if people with depression or people with schizophrenia had those chemical imbalances, right away, they're not finding it to be so. So as early as 1984, the NIMH saying, we're really not finding that there's a serotonergic abnormality in depressed patients. And here's the real betrayal. Now there's more research on this. By the way, the dopamine hyperactivity story basically fell apart in the early 90s as well. In 1998, I think it was, the American Psychiatric Association's own textbook said, the low serotonin theory is dead. We've looked at all these things. We haven't been able to find it, that there's this abnormality in depressed patients. And then in that chapter, they even say, and the theory was always sort of dumb, because there's no reason that the mechanism of disorder is the opposite of what the treatment does. So it's dead and buried in 1998. And then there's other pronouncements in psychiatric textbooks, like in 2000, it's just not real. So within psychiatric research circles, it was abandoned by really the late 1980s. But it had been such a great way to sell this new model, they kept selling it to the public. The drug companies did because they knew it was a way to sell drugs. But the American Psychiatric Association kept proposing it as well because it was, again, a way to sell sort of the discipline as one that's making these great advances in care. And that we are people solving a chemical imbalance. And so, for example, in 2005, the American Psychiatric Association put out a press release based on a survey, and it said, great news. One, people used to think that depression would pass. You could go to your priest or your friend, and it would pass. Now they understand it's a chemical imbalance, like 85%. Now, the only problem is sometimes they think that non-psychiatrists can fix chemical imbalances. What they need to really know is that we are the people that fix chemical imbalances in the brain. So even as their own literature was saying that's not true, that's why they were presenting it to the public. And in their website, up until like 5-6 years ago, talked about drugs that fix chemical imbalances in the brain. And of course, all these other medical websites did as well. And this is part of the tragedy. You can look at drugs and try to understand in what ways they might help people or not help people, what their spectrum of outcomes is. But if you have a society using drugs on a false basis, that they fix something that known is wrong, boy, that's a real betrayal, number one. Of course, it's a story that gets people to stay on their drugs. But finally, it's also, you can see why drugs that are prescribed according to a false understanding probably are going to become problematic in society with their adverse effects and their effects over the long term. But the biggest harm done from that story is that it changed how we see ourselves, changed how we see our kids. And you gave a story of someone on, a podcast and on stage and all. I think, by the way, I've seen that play going back a while. People now see themselves as damaged or abnormal in that way. Forever. This is a new sense of self. As opposed to, I'm an old guy. When I was growing up, we had, people who were screwed up, including yourself, okay? And bullies and anxiety people and that sort of thing. And, you'd have people who say, I'm feeling suicidal. Well, we sort of felt, okay, that's what happens to people too. All that was in the realm of normalcy, okay? And it was sort of like an existential view of life that, people suffered, people experienced difficulties, but it was part of the normal human journey. It was part of the human journey of growing up. And now that has changed. You get diverted into these diagnosed patterns, and that's a real loss to society. And it's a real loss to kids and our young kids.
Do you often suffer from headaches, muscle cramps, fatigue, or sleeplessness? It could be from an electrolyte deficiency. Drinking plain water may not be enough to replenish lost electrolytes, which is especially important for athletes, kids, breastfeeding moms, those who are on a low-carb diet, and it can help regulate appetite. Element was created by my co-author and good friend, Rob Wolf, and is free of artificial ingredients, food coloring, gluten, fillers, and sugar. To put it simply, Element is a drink mix that has everything you need and nothing you don't. Even US Olympic athletes rely on Element, and I personally recommend it to everyone in my nutrition practice. I love the raspberry and citrus flavors, and when you buy via my link, you'll get a free sample pack of a variety of flavors for you to try. Plus, they have a convenient subscription program that makes it easy for you to keep your favorite flavors fully supplied. Head over to sustainabledish.com/LMNT to give it a try. That's sustainabledish.com/LMNT.
Yeah. I was, do you mind if I share a personal story?
No, no, please do.
Yeah. So this is, so I met my future wife about, it's about 4 months before September 11th. And it was, we'd just been dating for about a month. And my mother had been psychologically abused by my father for 20 years. As his health deteriorated, he got worse and worse, and so she had taken sort of brunt of a lot of his anger and frustration and his pain and all of the other stuff. I had come home one day and found that she had overdosed on pills and discovered her. And it was a suicide attempt that we ended up kind of discovering afterwards. And you know, there's always an incredible amount of guilt associated with that. You should have tried to get her out earlier, but there was just an incredible amount of anger and guilt that you would sort of turn inwards on yourself. I tried to break up with Amy, after this happened. I knew her for a month. Right, Robert, I knew her for a month at this point. She said, I'm not going anywhere, right? And fast forward about 3 months later, she worked in World Trade Center 1. And so we had known each other for about 3 months. I was supposed to go study an art program in Florence, and we were going to try to figure out how to make our relationship work, going back and forth. I was going to be gone for close to 2 years. And September 11th happened, and I moved in with her that day. She worked for Cantor Fitzgerald, which lost,
Wow, the one that lost so many people. Okay, go on.
Yeah, and just through completely random events, she just wasn't there that day. They normally had a 7:00 a.m. meeting. They had canceled it the day before because 2 people had been laid off, and so she just wasn't there that day. And so, for us, our relationship was like 2 of the most traumatic moments of anybody's life, sort of coupled together within a 4-month period. And she was working 18-hour days to help to rebuild the company. She was head of media and communications for the company. So she was, front facing with all of the trauma associated with that, dealing with families. We were both volunteering to kind of work for all of that, but I'm also still dealing with my mother and trying to get her out of the house and any number of different things. And I remember going to the doctor and talking to them about everything that I'm feeling. And she's like, well, I think you have anxiety. Here, take this medication. And Robert, I'm just like, at the time, I didn't know how to relate to the absurdity of that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, an international crisis of, that we're still living through, plus a once in a lifetime total trauma in my own life. And she's like, well, you must have some sort of chemical imbalance, and here, take this pill. And I understand what she was doing. She was doing the same thing as the British Medical Journal would have done, right? She doesn't know what to say. You're not sleeping. You're dealing with all of this stuff. You're, going through an incredible amount of emotion. And so for 2 years, I was on that medication. And with the birth of my son, part of the reason why I ended up getting off of it was the day that he smiled for the first time. It was probably gas, who knows? Right? The day that he smiled for the first time, I felt nothing. So it just had taken away everything, right? It had taken away the highs and it had taken away the lows. And it was a really difficult situation for me to deal with because then I had to sort of pull myself off of it. And pulling yourself off of this medication is not easy. And you detail incredible stories in your book of people who realize, and through interviews on your podcast, of people who have been medicalized since they were teenagers, medicalized since they, had gone through some degree of trauma in their life, and realizing that putting people on this medication, keeping them on that for a long period of time, fundamentally changes so much of who you are. So I wonder if you can kind of talk about that, and then because I
Yeah,
do think these things are not benign.
no, no, no. Listen, I mean, first of all, the absurdity of the response to you and your wife now is just beyond comprehension in a way. You're both dealing with, I mean, her anxiety, her thinking must be so hard at this time, her emotional state. You've lost, not only have you lost people, but there's that whole sense of like, why wasn't I one there? This whole sort of thing. Then you have this whole sort of relationship with your mother that is, fraught with difficulty. And the idea is to put you on a benzodiazepine. And so there's a couple things here. I hear these stories all the time. And by the way, often in reaction to setback difficulties in life, much more minimal than what you're talking about. In other words, if you actually look at the sort of just a little setback in life, a little unhappiness. Oh, my wife's bothering me, or my kid's talking too much, or whatever. It is a defining moment in a life. It's like, the road in the woods that now splits, because there's a couple of things. When you go down that path of medicalization, number one, frankly, you no longer often have the same emotional responses, energy, to bring to bear on what you need to do. So you're sort of numbed out from being able to really sort of move forward. That's number one. Number two, it does change your brain. Your brain, because it's such has so many feedback mechanisms, it's going to try to compensate for your being on the drug. Okay, it's going to basically, if say for an antidepressant, raise the serotonin, your own brain's going to dial down its serotonergic machinery. Now that has a couple things. That's why you have so much trouble coming off. Your brain has become used to this drug. And by the way, it's changed your brain in sort of profound ways, because serotonin doesn't act on its own. There's all sort of feedback loops between neurotransmitter systems. So now you're going to have trouble coming off. Benzos are really difficult to come off. SSRIs are going to get trouble come off. And now so often when you have trouble, doctors say, oh, see, this is why you need to be on the drug. It's sort of proof of the chemical imbalance story. So what happens is, you said it's not benign. What happens is we have a society now that takes a moment of difficulty and sends people down the mental illness path, or the medicated life path. And think about this, something like 20 to 25% of Americans that are older than 12 now take a psychiatric drug on a daily basis. So that's how many people who've been shunted down this path. And what you find with that path long-term is physical impairments, or physical difficulties, whether it be weight gain, some sexual impairments so often, a lot of emotional blunting happens. The amazing thing is you actually see a worsening on the whole, a chronification of the symptoms themselves, and often some cognitive decline. So what you see is we have a society with this story that takes difficult moments in life. Your story is of a very difficult time in life between the two of you. I don't know what happened to Amy, whether she was put down this medicalized path, but we have a way of thinking that sends so many people down this medicalized path. And yes, I hear all the time from people who are medicated at age 5, age 8, age 12, and they feel they lost their life. For those that then eventually are able to get off or come out of that sort of narrative, they feel they had their childhood stolen from them.
Yeah.
And you know what else they feel they had stolen from them? The chance to sort of deal with their difficulties as children, and to sort of grow and socialize and make something of themselves on their own, having that chance to fail, so to speak, to suffer through difficulties. So they talk about that. So yeah, your story is a personal anecdote that writ large tells of you managed to get off.
Yeah.
And you managed to get off because you said, I should be thrilled to death to see, I should just have a surge of elation when I see my son smile. Because that is such an extraordinary thing to see a new being come to life and smile, right? I mean, it's knock you down elation when you see it. I have some grandchildren, and I just saw one who's 6 months old smiling. I thought, this is the greatest thing in life. And now you as a father can't experience that joy. Well, at least you had the wherewithal to say, I need to get on. But it was hard, right? I bet it wasn't easy after 2 years on those drugs.
No, I mean, you do find in many ways, you're a stranger to yourself.
Yeah.
And, I think for me, the wisdom of it was that, pain is a tool. And so psychological pain, dealing with a lot of this stuff and then having those hard conversations, it forces you to move and to, if you're in a dead end job and you're feeling the pain of that, the pain is telling you that you're living in an environment that is not associated with who you are. And that's environmental stressors, it's any number of different things associated with that. And so to blunt that pain means that you end up in a place that is just as painful as just you've created a sort of a neuropathic response to it. And but the pain is still there, right? And I think that is it took me going through all of that and then in finding myself, refining myself afterwards to also deal with, like, I had to find out what made me happy. There were whole other associated parts of that are just childhood trauma and seeing my parents go through years and years of, their reaction to my father's reaction to everything was just blunt force trauma, just anger, and so, you have to work through a lot of that stuff. One of the
Can I
things I
say one
found,
thing real quickly, James?
yeah,
This actually shows up in the research literature, what you're talking about. So there was a big study, a 6-year study of depression by the NIMH. And so they take people who have the same sort of baseline characteristics, and now they follow them for 6 years and look for those who get treated and those who do not. Those who get treated actually had a decline in their social status at the end of 6 years, and were much more were still often chronically depressed. Those who avoided treatment, actually, they saw that first of all, many of them got divorced. They actually had elevated their status, their earning status, because exactly what you're saying is they took that pain and they made changes in their life. That's what they saw. That was a 6-year NIMH study. And by the way, in the 1970s with psychotic patients, they did a study of the same sort. What happened at the end of 1 year to people who you medicated versus those who didn't medicate? Well, those who weren't medicated with antipsychotics had better outcomes, okay? They were actually less likely to still be suffering from psychotic symptoms, and they were much more socially engaged. So they asked people, what was it like to go through your psychotic episode without antipsychotics? And here's what the people told them. It was horrible. It was painful. I was suffering, but here comes the but. In retrospect, I'm glad I had the opportunity to do so, because that was what enabled me to change and to sort of come to a different space. And the researchers at that time said, when we blunt emotions, even in psychotic episodes, maybe we're taking away a tool that these people need in order to come out of this in a different place. So that actually shows up in the research literature. So your experience and what you talked about is, in fact, you can find it in the scientific literature. So sorry about stopping you there, but
no. One of the things that I found really interesting, and I wanted to kind of talk to you about, and I don't want to forget it. I wanted because just the mixing of a lot of these drugs. What I found kind of interesting, there is one story in there where where you were talking about somebody who had been hospitalized and diagnosed, and how they keep on sort of moving these things, dosages, percentages, different drugs. You move from benzodiazepines to antipsychotics. You start to mix those together. I mean, they can't possibly know how these drugs are interacting in the brain. I just wonder if you can kind of talk about that. It's just,
Yeah,
it's so fascinating to me.
the polypharmacy is just a story of a profession that's lost its way.
Yeah.
Because there's no study anywhere that shows multiple drugs, like 4 or 5 drugs, is beneficial. None of these different types. And part of the irony, of course, is one drug's trying to do one thing, and then you have another drug that's doing the other thing. They're actually at cross purposes, say antipsychotics and antidepressants. So first of all, why did it develop? It developed actually because the first drug causes adverse effects. So
Right.
they now give it, instead of saying, well, that's a problem, now they try to give a drug to like counter that. It also comes out because the first drug doesn't work. Okay, so maybe the antidepressant's really not lifting it. So, well, it will numb people out with the antipsychotic. And you got this sense within the profession that we are, quote, psychopharmacologists. And they sort of adopted a personality of like, I call it a witch doctor personality of like mixing potions. And you're supposedly the one that can mix up a potion with 4 or 5 drugs that finally hits the right target. But really what you see over and over again in the narratives of people who do this, once they go down the polypharmacy route, next thing you know, they're searching through all sorts of drugs. And why? Because when you're on 4 or 5 drugs, it's hard to have any sort of stability and capacity to respond well. And so really, when you hear about polypharmacy, that's a broken discipline. Because literally, if the first drug's not working, maybe you should take it away as opposed to just add. And we had a crazy case in Massachusetts recently. Not crazy, it's a tragic case. A really tragic case, and it's an extreme case, but when you see the polypharmacy, because by the way, often people use polypharmacy now right from the start. You go to a mental hospital, you often come out with 3 or 4. There's a woman named Lindsay Clancy. She was a delivery and labor nurse at Massachusetts General Hospital. Was known as a consummate caregiver. This is a really tragic story, but it's now in the news. So when she has with her first 2 children, she had some bouts of postpartum depression. Now the third one, last May, she has a child, and she's managing it okay. She's managing it with health reasons, okay, doing yoga. She's not sinking into postpartum depression. However, in September, she starts becoming anxious because her maternity leave is ending, and going back to this job with 3 kids is sort of anxiety provoking. This is the story in the news. Well, then on January 24th, she killed her 3 kids. She strangles them. And we're now hearing 3 different narratives. The prosecution saying she's just an evil person. So, but how did someone that was a consummate caregiver become an evil person? The medical story is she had postpartum depression or postpartum psychosis. And so the disease made her do it. But then you wonder why she was getting treated. Did she have treatment resistant? And then the defense's point of view is they came out with her regimen of drugs, 13 psychiatric drugs, like antipsychotics, benzodiazepines, antidepressants, all mixed together, and Ambien, all mixed together.
Right.
So the person who did this horrible thing, and then she threw herself out the window, but she survived. She was hearing command hallucinations is what it was. Well, all we do know is this. If you're on 13 psychiatric drugs, it's meant to change your brain. It's meant to change how you experience the world. And there's no evidence anywhere that 13 psychiatric drugs is going to be of benefit to you. So the mere thought that you could put someone on 13 psychiatric drugs and cycle through all these drugs just shows the insanity of polypharmacy. Because there's no way that possibly is going to help this woman cope with life, respond to life, be able to be. And her husband, of course, was complaining to the psychiatrist, my wife has become a zombie on this polypharmacy. So yeah, we hear this all the time. It's just like initial prescription as part of that road that's now taken so often leads to polypharmacy. And when you're on did you ever get on polypharmacy?
No.
You personally? Okay, well, you apparently were coping pretty well. But that's a road that is really taking you deep into a life as a mental patient.
Yeah. I don't even know where to go with that story. I mean, I do. Yeah. I mean, you had recently a podcast that was talking to a doctor who was talking specifically about a lot of the interaction of these medications with it during pregnancy, which I just thought, you know, and one of the things I really appreciate about your podcast uh, is the level to which there is nuance, right? If people are suffering, if they are on these drugs, if they become pregnant, what is a way to interact with these medications that somebody's been on, so that the consumer is that the mother and the parents are aware of the interactions that is happening. You know, and I do find it, you know, I don't know. I mean, there is just so much to deal with. There's a level of complexity that is really hard for us to you know to even move around. You know, I have a nephew who's been on, you know, a mix of cocktails since he was 4 years old. Um, you know, and I don't know what to do with that. I mean, I just think the medicalization of childhood, the way that they were, even just the DSM and the pharmaceutical companies have been able to medicalize everything to do with, you know, especially boys,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So boys can't. I spent a decade teaching nutrition education in public schools, mainly inner city schools. So we worked with kids who were on or below the poverty line, specifically schools that we wanted to work with. A lot of kids are medicated, but they're also dropped off at like 7:30 in the morning, and they're picked up at 6 o'clock at night. And the parents are both working, and you know, in many different ways, they sit in the classroom all day long. The schools are great schools. They try to get the kids moving as much as possible, but within the academic scope of what you're supposed to do. Sitting a boy down for, you know, 11 hours, 12 hours a day, and then expecting him to be able to pay attention is just it absolutely absurd. So I wonder if you can kind of talk a little bit about that sort of the medicalization of childhood, and then some of the aspects of that.
Well, I think the medicalization of childhood is one of the great, it's just, the harm done is almost unimaginable. So you take a 4-year-old and now you're saying they need to be medicated for the rest of their life. And you know, what is that going to do to that child? Is that child's ability to learn, that to engage socially, to play sports, self-conceptions? That moment when you diagnose that 4-year-old or 6-year-old, you're sending their life down a different path, which takes them away. Now, I'm not religious, okay, but I'm going to use a religious description. Their God-given right to experience the world with their full faculties and try to make something of themselves and suffer the slings and arrows of childhood. Now, going to your description of our schools, that idea that boys and girls can sit in a classroom for 11 hours or just sort of in this controlled environment is insane. It's completely divorced from any understanding of what childhood should be and like, and who young boys are, young girls are. You know what young boys and girls love to do? They love to play.
Yeah.
They love to make games. And that's how they socialize. That's how they form bonds. They move around. And they're not built to sit in a chair for hours on end and hear someone, you know, to do whatever the instruction might be. So, you know, it's interesting. One thing you're talking about nutrition. I know there have been programs in certain schools where instead of teaching nutrition, they teach kids to cook.
Yeah, that
Now,
was ours.
what's that? Is that what you guys did?
Yeah, yeah.
Because now teaching people to cook is you learn a skill. That's a very different thing. And you're active, you're learning about food, you're learning about nutrition. And by the way, so if now people are up on their feet too, right? They're not sitting in a chair. Well, that's a good exercise. And I know usually kids love learning that exercise and they take that home with them. So rather than blaming the kid, this is us as a society. What's our responsibility? Is it to build schools that are consonant with what childhood is like? Or is it to create schools that supposedly make these kids good automatons when they grow up, able to do whatever job and whatever, and fit the sort of capitalistic structure of our society, where often two people need to work and all this sort of thing. What's our obligation? Well, in my opinion, the first obligation of any society is to create a world that nurtures children in ways that stirs their curiosity, their self-confidence, their ability to engage socially apart from us. And what this tells you, all the anxiety that we have, all the diagnosis we have of our kids, all the sense of not being competent that we see in many of our young kids, that's not their failure. That's our failure to nurture our children in a way, or to organize our society in a way that nurtures children. And that is a grievous, grievous, grievous failure of our society. It's tragic, and it really is robbing children of their right to be. Their right to learn, grow up, socialize, play, make mistakes, be assholes, have all sorts of emotions running through you that you can't hardly control. That's growing up. We're not letting them be in this way, and it is so incredibly tragic and wrong and harmful from my point of view. And no society in human history has done this before. Medicate their kids to this degree. And one final thing about Adam Urato and the pregnancy story. Yeah, listen, people do suffer. And they do struggle. And they struggle in our society during the prenatal period, the postpartum period. We're actually coming out with a story about this as well. There's two different problems here. Adam's talking, part of the problem is women come in would become pregnant on the medication. Now you're really with a dilemma in a way, because it's quite clear that antidepressant exposure during pregnancy does raise risks of some sort for fetal development. That's well recognized. But then coming off those drugs can be very difficult as well, and expose people to withdrawal effects and rebound effects. So one of the things that Adam talks about is, how do you talk about people with this that arrive on the drugs and try to manage it? And it isn't a one size fits all, and I do appreciate that. But this shows how the fact that we have, so if you would have been around in 1985, what percentage of women were exposed to antidepressants during pregnancy? You have any idea? 1 in 300. Now it's 8%. It's because of this whole medicalization of life and stuff. But it does present a problem in pregnancy because people are that way, but we know we have this fetal risk. Now, the other thing is, though, you don't also see studies so sometimes people get newly prescribed antidepressants. You don't see that actually diminishes, quote, the depression in prenatal women or even postpartum women. And why is this? Because what are they really struggling with? They're struggling so often with a society that doesn't give them material and social supports that they need. Right. So if you ask women who are pregnant and struggling, or new mothers, they'll talk about, well, I need more social support. So I may have material needs. I can't feed my baby. And maybe I can't even get transportation to go someplace. So really, that distress you're seeing in our society, this also fits with kids. Maybe we need to change what sort of supports we give to those people who become pregnant, mothers and fathers. And for example, in Sweden, they give mothers and fathers extended leave. Well, the minute they do that, it shows that relieves a lot of the distress. So what I'm trying to say is this whole medicalization of life, it blinds us to seeing social determinants of health. And how can we change the environment to better fit our kids, to better help people who become pregnant the first year, which are difficult years. And, we medicalize things. We say the problem's always in the individual, the kid or the woman. What we need is to say as a society, how are these problems reflective of how we organize our society? That's a very different question.
Yeah. And, there's a wonderful book called Invisible Women, and it talks a lot about sort of economic determinants of just for females in society. Children, like we build kitchens for men. So, the average height of a woman is, within this
I never
range.
thought about
So,
that.
yeah.
Yeah, that's really true. Where are the cabinets?
So we have this invisible sort of patriarchal structure that really just defines our society. Women are typically the caregivers. They take care of older, they take care of grandparents, they take care of parents. We will plow roads, so that men can get to work, but women typically take public transportation within cities. And so we don't shovel sidewalks as much. So the injury rate among women is actually higher. Any number of different determinant factors are kind of part of that to just sort of keep this economic system going. Amy's company has maternal leave and paternal leave. You can work from home. They have the ability to be able to do that, but she sets it up as a structure, a basic structure of the company. And why is it set up that way? Because most of the people who work there are women. And so it's just a completely different way of sort of moving. And it's a highly successful company with, some really dynamic ideas of, changing debt structures, credit card rates, paying back student loans, any number of different economic incentives to sort of move through these sort of fintech companies so that people aren't just paying interest rates for the rest of their lives on stuff, but because it's so diverse, racially diverse and gender diverse in many different ways, the whole structure changes. And so it's just a really interesting concept. I don't want to go too far off onto that stuff, but it does. We sort of pathologize motherhood. I do think that we live 99% of our existence as hunter-gatherers, and newborn babies and babies are shared amongst a larger group of people. I think postpartum depression is, a pathology that arises because we do expect a couple to raise a child. And it's just, like you said, never before in human history has that actually been the norm. And so, there are just so many sort of elements, and then I'm just rambling at this point.
No, listen, I think what you talked about with what Amy does, that's what we need. So rather than we keep going down, there's, you'll hear talk, oh, we're going to find this chemical to fix depression. We're going to find this chemical to a new drug for postpartum depression that's cost like God knows what, an injection. That's just going down the same rabbit hole. Yeah. And what Amy's talking about or doing, her company, is reorganizing a whole social structure that people exist in, right? Yeah. And the problem is that's great for that company, but does the single mother who's in a service job, does she get to leave? In other words, we don't have a larger societal response to this that extends these sort of supports to the whole population. So I think it's sort of as an incubator lab, what they're doing is fantastic. But somehow we need to have a political process that takes that information and extends it to us as a society as a whole.
Yeah. There's a story about, I was reading a few years back, so I'm going to get some of the details wrong of it. In the 70s, Canada had instituted a sort of pilot program for universal basic income. They'd taken a small rural town. It was a single commodity crop town, so probably rapeseed or something like that. But, the sort of 1970s, you could have a structure built off of like one export product where you'd have doctors and diners and, shops and everything, like small town America. And so they instituted a universal basic income. It wasn't a lot, but what it was, the program was cut off by a change in administrations that happened within the Canadian government, and a lot of the research was sort of buried. It was kind of left. So recently, people started to kind of pull it out. Universal basic income, it's become a kind of a new idea, a resurrected idea. And so what they looked at was a number of different factors that had an effect. One is you didn't have to live in a toxic work environment. You could find another job. You could leave. So you were held into a system of penury that wouldn't ever allow you to get out of it. So people left jobs, and asshole employers, gone. And there were whole numbers. Divorce rates went down, maternal and child health went up, rates of autism went down, any number of different factors that were not associated with income, right? An economic model, all of these different multifactorial things started to change. Everything got better, and so of course they just got rid of it. But but I do think that that is the level of stress, is an invisible stressor in our society. And we know this, right? We know your IQ will actually go down percentage points if you have outstanding bills. We know that if you're living sort of paycheck to paycheck, there are whole numbers of different factors that wouldn't have associated with, like if we want to build a happy society, if we want to build something that looks like an ideal, shining city on the hill, we have to think about these things in multifactorial ways.
Yeah, if I remember that study you were talking about, or that experiment, didn't they find that the people, in fact, they left jobs, but they had some time even to do some schooling and stuff, and they moved into sort of higher level jobs. That was one of the things that happened. So it benefited the society as a whole, but the sort of time away, some support gave them, well, as you say, new opportunities. They could leave the toxic job. But if I remember right, it's not just they sort of moved to at a lateral level necessarily to a job sort of equal pay or whatever. They moved up the scale. Yeah, my frustration is, this all goes to like this sort of neoliberal world we live in. That, it's like we're dominated by sort of these economic ideas that somehow it's sort of a Darwinian story,
Yeah.
And it really is that I don't know, everyone's supposed to make their own way, and if they're having difficulties, that's their problem.
Yeah.
And it's just, and one of the things you're talking about, we have a lot less class fluidity than even I think in the UK and stuff. In other words, what class you're born into, what percentile, et cetera. It's much harder to rise from one level to a higher level. Because we have this myth that it's so easy to sort of make something of yourself and move into the sort of better off classes, but actually you don't see that much movement anymore. Some sort of, people who grow up in difficult situations into ones where they're now sort of flourishing economically. I mean, it happens, but it's just not to the degree we want to believe it's possible.
Yeah, and I think that brings us sort of full circle in our conversation, because we, 19th century had the rise of Darwinian ideas, and then social Darwinism kind of took over. That moved very quickly and swiftly into eugenics and social control, and the idea of sort of innate, qualities such as IQ, measurements of intelligence that were considered to be many ways like a static thing. You're born. All of those structures are still part of that sort of Darwinian idea. And whether or not Charles actually had any relationship with it, his nephew really wanted to build something that was sort of based off of that. And I do think it is an element of social control that takes away the individual's ability to sort of understand this stuff. It's sort of an interesting way to kind of come full circle and to say thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. I really do appreciate your work. It's amazing.
No, thanks, James. And it's been a real pleasure talking to you. So it really was a joy to be here with you today.
Yeah, I'll put your website and your podcast and everything like that in the show notes, and get people to sort of come to your book. I do think it's like you said, the DSM, very important book. This one, Anatomy.
That may be the biggest compliment I've ever heard. So thank you.
Anatomy of an Epidemic, Magic Bullets, Psychiatric Drugs, and the Astonishing Rise of Mental Illness in America by Robert Whitaker. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Real pleasure.
Sure.
Thanks so much for listening today and for following my work. If you believe in making sure people all over the world should have access to nutritious food, please join my mission through my nonprofit, the Global Food Justice Alliance. Visit sustainabledish.com/join and become a Sustaining member today. All Sustaining members get early access to ad-free podcasts plus free downloads, and you'll be helping get healthy protein like meat, fish, and eggs to food insecure kids. That's sustainabledish.com/join. And thank you.